Hello, this is Rigmio, and welcome to the Falsifighters Champions C-Tier Gauntlet Tournament. This tournament should be very interesting not only because of the low power level, but because we are experimenting with the modified Confusion Clause. Additionally, this is a quite large tournament with 38 total players. If you want to take a look, all the rules are laid out on screen, so feel free to pause. With that out of the way, let's get right into the match. So, my immediate thought with this team is that the main things I need to focus on are Goyle and Django. Goyle is very annoying with Confuse and Rallying Cry with an attack boost for the AZ to boot. Django can do very good damage with its high crit chance and its ability to poison. What I was not thinking about going into this was how much of a problem Django would be. As you will see shortly, Django is able to get super excite down on my team using fire spines, and I do not have any kind of efficient way to clear that, meaning that I'm kind of at the mercy of where I get rotated to. Immediately, super excite goes down onto Gorgo, and I realize that positioning is going to be a huge factor, and that I am not prepared for it. I also realize at this point that I am concerned that I do not have the bulk to outlive Django with choosing to bring Gorgo instead of Pendem. I was worried that Pendem would not get very good opportunities to spread Confuse and that Django would be able to do too much damage to it, but Django is a real threat in terms of damage dealing, as you can see with that huge chunk to Delta. So bringing something that is specifically weak to its element was not a good decision going into the match. Luckily, I get a very good rotation to start with, so I'm not necessarily punished for my lack of planning around Super Excite. And I'm able to start spreading decent damage with Anomalo. However, it is a relatively bulky team, so Anomalo is not able to spread damage quite as efficiently as it can against some of the frailer teams in the format. I also decide to set up Payback with Delta in order to limit my opponent's options into it. BigGigantes then decides to set up another Super Excite on Anomalo, further guaranteeing that I am completely out of position on my turn, and goes for Torrent Wave on Django, which is absolutely the right choice, allowing them to totally ignore Payback and spread massive damage alongside Poison across my team. And at this point, it's looking very rough for me. I've taken an extremely high amount of damage, and while I deal relatively good damage in return, I'm worried might not be enough. Additionally, I get rotated to a absolutely abysmal position, so I have to consider trying to potentially get a Confuse with Delta, or if it can do any damage to Django. I consider trying to go for Scare with Gorgo, but it just doesn't seem like it's going to efficiently deal with my opponent's team, so I end up deciding to just do a small amount of chip with Anomalo and save my FP for the following turn. And out of position, Anomalo is not doing very much damage. And obviously, I'm in really rough shape. Torrent Wave especially would do incredibly high spread damage, and my opponent recognizes this and chooses to go for it. Which, of course, takes Delta out, in addition to absolutely chunking Anomalo and Gorgo. Now, luckily I'm able to take a moment to heal and clear statuses using Sparkling Heal. And Gorgo does do very high damage, so I intend to use that to put some pressure on Django, but at this point in the match I just doubt that I have the steam to close out. And Nightmare combo is doing incredibly good damage into Django. I get the scare, but Django's still above half health, and the scare may or may not do what I want it to. Luckily Django has fewer moves than many Vivasaurs, so scare is especially effective on it. However, it's almost certainly not going to be able to make a difference in the game state that we are in. As long as they are able to set up Super Excite on my team, I will never have an opportunity to make large amounts of progress, because I have to worry about trying to clear it and being out of position, which means I have to be using Anomalo to get Sparkling Heal down, and even beyond that they land the Confuse from Goyle, meaning that Gorgo is not going to be doing very much useful stuff. And additionally, as you can see, using enough of my FP that I can't do any clearing with Anomalo. And at this point I have for sure lost the game. I play it out, I try to do the damage that I can. Anomalo's extremely strong in late game, so, I hope that if my opponent badly misplays, I will be able to use Anomalo to bring myself back into it. But assuming my opponent plays well, I should essentially be out of the game at this point. And Torrent Wave is once again the correct play. I am simply not able to get enough damage down in order to outpace that. And at this point, Gorgo is lost, Anomalo is incredibly low health, and it's just too much ground to try to make up. Gorgo once again getting the scare on Django and doing big damage. However, Gorgo dies to the auto counter, and while I am able to take this opportunity to heal Anomalo, I simply am not going to be able to outdamage an entire team with just Anomalo, no matter how good Anomalo is. That being said, I rotate Anomalo to the back, and once again I just have to hope that this scare is absolutely neutering Django, and that my opponent makes mistakes in their play. However, they are keeping up the pressure. As long as they can keep me super excited, I have to choose between doing damage and clearing the super excite, and it's not really beneficial either way. If I'm not clearing the super excite, I'm going to end up in a bad position, and if I do clear it, then I'm getting no damage down in a game state where I'm already so behind damage. Super Excite doesn't actually matter which way it goes this time, they both have the same outcome. And while I could choose to go for Anomalo Twist to try and finish off Django and bank FP towards healing next turn, I recognize that I'm just extremely far behind in damage, and that they're going to be able to continue applying statuses and dealing damage to me. So all I can hope for is to be able to out-damage them and have them make mistakes in their play. And immediately, it's not looking good. BigGigantes is playing exactly as well as you possibly could in this situation. She has the advantage and is maintaining it perfectly. And there's just essentially nothing I can do from this point. I was hoping that I could win on misplays or luck, but neither are on my side. My opponent is playing well, and they land their status, and the game is sealed from here. Luckily, I believe that their next team is not nearly as scary. This team has an excellent matchup into mine, in addition to just being an extremely powerful team. And I have taken a second to get used to my team and recognize some of the mistakes I made in who I brought and how I played, so that I can hopefully clear things up for next game to bring it back. But with that, game 1 is over and I've lost. For game 2, I decide to use the same team. I think it's probably my stronger team, and I think that it has a good matchup into this team. Additionally, I decide to bring Pendem as opposed to Gorgo. This team has a variety of water Vivosaurs, as well as the fact that the biggest threat on this team is Anomalo, who of course Pendem matches up very well into. They choose to bring Anomalo, Packy, and Gomp, which is a scary team because it means that they have access to Super Harden from 2 different sources, meaning that it will be difficult to target anything down if they catch on and start super hardening that Vivosaur. It also means that they have a variety of very strong team skills between Packy's Poison, Gomp's Confuse, and Anomalo's Damage. And immediately, BigGigantes shows this off with Ice Crusher. It has a 25% Confuse chance, and unfortunately hits Confuse on both Delta and Pendem, which is a absolutely disastrous start for me. At this point, I only hope that they don't use too much of my FP, so that I can at least start spreading some damage with Anomalo. Unfortunately, Delta Blitz does use a solid majority of my FP. It does solid damage to Packy, but it means that I'm not able to go for Anomalo's team skill, so I instead decide to go for Anomalo Twist. Despite only costing 60 FP, it does solid chip to Gomp, but I am pretty immediately on the back foot with this opener. Thankfully, with the modified Confusion Clause, my opponent still cannot spam Confuse while I still have Confuse down on my Vivasaurs. They have to wait for it to wear off. But they can, of course, start spreading damage with things like Icy Exhalation or Anomalo's Team Skill. They land poison on all three of my Vivasaurs, which means that I'm going to be taking really threatening chip. And they choose to super harden Packy. Most likely because it took the most damage last turn between Delta and because it has the poison skills to allow it to spread some damage. Now, Spin Attack is not what I was hoping for, however it is relatively cheap, and it does put damage onto what is for certain the most threatening Vivasaur on their side, which is Anomalo. And with the amount of FP I have, I can go for a Chopper Cyclone to start getting big damage down on their team. With 2 Water Vivasaurs and perfect range on Anomalo, it should allow me to do pretty large chip, and it does. So despite the difficult start with Confusion, I'm in a pretty good spot here. We both have taken very similar amounts of damage, but my team is very, very strong in the end game, and my Anomalo has taken the least damage on my team, whereas theirs has taken the most, and Anomalo is what I think is the strongest Vivasaur on both teams. Gomp chooses to go for Ice Crusher again, and unfortunately lands Confusion on both Pendem and Anomalo. This is definitely the scary part about modified Confusion Clause. When Confusion is able to land on multiple members of your team, it can be very debilitating. And Gomp is a rather potent user of it, alongside someone like Pendem, who I have not had a chance to go for any kind of spread confusion with due to it being confused. Here I choose to go for Delta Blitz, not only because it should allow me to do pretty good damage to Gomp, but because I'm hoping to hit the 30% confuse, which I do. This should shut down Gomp from being able to immediately go for an AoE confused when my confusion wears off, and I am hopeful that it will also waste their FP. Gomp combo into Delta is not necessarily ideal, especially with the crit, however, it's also not a bad outcome. It wastes a decent chunk of their FP, prevents them from using Packy's team skill, and Delta takes it somewhat well. They choose to go for Anomalo's team skill, which is almost certainly the correct choice here, spreading solid damage across my team once again. Fortunately, because Pendem and Anomalo both have relatively high defense, it's not proving to be too intense, which it definitely can be for a lot of the frailer teams in the format. However, I'm still taking very significant chip and am clearly in a disadvantageous position. Anomalo Hurricane, however, is a relatively good thing to roll here. It is another spread move similar to Anomalo's team skill. It does cost significantly more, but it allows me to get really good damage across the board, and is one of the best options that could have come from having both Anomalo and Pendem confused there. I choose to counter Delta, hoping that Gomp will, in its confusion, attack into it and take some chip damage. Which it does attack into it, but unfortunately Gomp Stomp is not counterable. So Delta just gets chunked. However, it does at least use enough FP that they cannot go for a team skill on Anomalo or Paki, and with counter up, they cannot safely kill Delta this turn. They recognize this and instead choose to target down my Anomalo, and because of the crit, it is pretty decent damage, but I'm finally going to have a turn without confusion on multiple of my Vivasaurs, which should allow me to start really getting back into the game. Chopper Cyclone, of course, allows me to get big spread damage, which has been the goal this whole time. And here I had hoped to target down Anomalo afterwards, but knocking Paki into Parting Blow instead of getting the kill means that I had to go for it. I probably should have used Delta to finish off Paki and then used Pendem to get damage on Anomalo, but I did it in the reverse order. I'm not even sure why. I think I just saw that Pendem's move costs less FP and chose to go for it. I use Delta to at least get a little bit of damage down. It's debatable whether or not that was worth the FP, but I didn't think FP would be an issue since I figured Delta would likely go down this turn, and if it doesn't, because of FP+, I'd still be in a solid place. They choose to use Sparkling Heal, which is smart here. I'm not currently out damaging 150 heal, so it buys them some time. And I was expecting either a kill into Delta here or a team skill to try and spread Confuse, which meant that it was going to come down to how they hit the 25%, but they instead chose to go for an attack into Anomalo, and due to the accuracy drop and Gomp's lower than average accuracy, it misses. This turn really properly brings me back into the game. I now have all three of my Vivasaurs to fire back with, and it is going to be difficult for them to deal with. They will have to choose who they are dealing with. If they want to deal with Delta, they can't get much damage down on the other two, and I will be able to heal them with Anomalo. If they just try to spread damage, I have better spread damage with Anomalo and Pendem. And if they go for Pendem, then Anomalo and Delta should be able to mount a comeback on their own. And here I decide to go for Ancient Boulder with Pendem, hoping to land some confusions. getting a confusion, especially on Anomalo, would be game-winning here. However, I miss both confusions. That said, it still does relatively good damage, and I rotate back and get a little bit more damage in with Anomalo. I re-up payback more than anything just to discourage them from being able to use a low FP move to finish Delta off easily. This forces them to properly commit to something that will finish off Delta. They choose to go for Chopper Cyclone, however, when down a team member, it does very little damage, so while it is able to finish off Delta, it does chip, but not anything meaningful to Anomalo and Pendem. They then go for Gomp Stomp into Anomalo, which does have a chance to miss, but connects, finishing off Anomalo. However, from this position, it's going to be a very close game. Pendem is going to be hard to kill, and I can keep it out of Anomalo's best range. I don't have to worry about Gomp hitting that hard as well, so I can just afford to use Tantrum to fish for confuses and spread damage, and they can't damage me that effectively. It's going to come down a lot to just how much damage they're able to do, because it is going to be close, and whether or not either of us is able to land a confusion on the other. Tantrum does unfortunately miss Confuse on both, however does significant damage, so if they cannot confuse me this turn, they are going to lose, and they almost certainly do not have the damage to kill me this turn, meaning that it's going to come down to a 1 in 4 chance. BigGigantes recognizes this and goes for Ice Crusher to hopefully get the confusion. However, they do finally miss a confusion, meaning that this game is almost certainly sealed. Anomalo combo will do a little bit, but nowhere near enough to kill, even with a crit. And with one last Pendem Tantrum, I am able to close out the game. It was very close, and being able to spread confusion with Gomp almost certainly played a large factor in this. However, even in this lower power format, the spread confusion is not necessarily game determining, which is part of why we are exploring this modified confusion clause. I'm not sure that I am a fan of it, but I do think that this shows that it is not necessarily format-alteringly powerful. It is still very much manageable. They are still going to be able to bring Anomalo, which is very scary, but I am going to be able to do really large damage with Django getting support from Goyle. and their team is not bulky enough to be able to deal with it that well. I considered switching Gomp out for U-Raptor, as Gomp will take significant damage from Anomalo, but decide that the defensive boost from Gomp, between giving a defense boost to Django and having Super Harden, will make up for the fact that it's going to be taking more damage from Anomalo by helping my team weather the storm and outdamage them. And here they choose to go for the safer play of Chopper Cyclone to start spreading damage, rather than trying to land spread confusion. And it does do some damage to my team, but my team is relatively bulky, so it's not anything substantial. And they super harden Packy. I'm not sure why they are choosing to super harden Packy here. Perhaps because I do so much damage and Packy can be very frail. However, I do think that Anomalo is almost the entirety of their team's damage, and so needs to be protected. And recognizing that, with perfect range and a 30% increase to Django's attack, I immediately go for Poison Spines and hit a huge crit onto Anomalo alongside Poison to essentially deal half of Anomalo's health immediately. And then Super Harden. I debate who to put it on. Django is obviously my main damage source, however is tanky enough to kind of deal on its own, whereas Goyle is taking a little bit more damage and is important to have around. It can do big damage to both Packy and Gomp, as well as spread Confuse and clear Confusion, so it is going to be very important to have for the matchup. They choose to go for Icy Exhalation here, spreading Poison. It does miss Gomp, but is able to poison my other two Vivasaurs, allowing them to do damage to Goyle, ignoring the Super Harden. However, 15% is not going to be super substantial, since most of Goyle's bulk is in its defense rather than health, and they do recognize that they need to put Super Harden up on Anomalo here. Because Django has more of its bulk focused in health, I consider Rallying Cry it, but decided it'd be better to get some damage down on Gomp, and landing the Confusion is also incredibly helpful. It can waste their FP and forces Packy to be super hardening if they are going to keep super harden up. I Spike Tail Gomp as well, and once again hit for a rather large crit. And at this point, despite the fact that the poison goes off on both my Vivasaurs and I no longer have Super Harden, they are in a very difficult position with the Confusion and are taking such significant damage that it puts them in a very difficult spot. They choose to go for Chopper Cyclone to spread some damage, and it does spread very good damage across the team. However, it is not as targeted of damage as my Django is able to do. They're forced to once again Super Harden on Anomalo, but with Confusion on Gomp and Super Harden on Anomalo essentially necessary, they're only able to get off that bit of damage with Anomalo, which gives me the opportunity to continue doing huge chunks with Django. Here I do decide to put Super Harden back down on Goyle. It's down to around half health, and I once again want to make sure to keep it around. And I choose to Poison Spines. And I think about who to target for a while before deciding on Packy, as it is very vulnerable here, and it is, once it gets hit, for an absolutely massive crit. And at this point I'm essentially forcing them to choose who they are saving, because they are all in danger of taking large chunks of damage from Django. Gomp here wastes a little bit of FP, but nothing substantial. They both take 1 damage, but it does mean that they can't go for Chopper Cyclone plus Super Harden, which is very important. They instead choose to go for Icy Exhalation to spread poison, but unfortunately only hit Django. And with Rallying Cry only hitting 1 of the statuses means that I am able to deal with it incredibly safely. And I do exactly that, starting the turn off with Rallying Cry onto Django, meaning that they got no damage in with their last turn. And then I am able to poison Spines into Anomalo. Crit plus poison would likely kill here, and I do in fact hit crit plus poison. They won't have enough FP for Sparkling Heal, so I have safely dealt with Anomalo, meaning that I now no longer have to worry about damage pretty much at all. So at this point I can start focusing on Gomp, whose confusion is the main risk to my team at this point in the match. They go for Chopper Cyclone, getting a little bit more damage out of Anomalo before it dies to the poison at the end of a turn. And as is expected from Anomalo, it does quite good chip damage. However, at this point in the match, that's not going to be enough. With Anomalo gone, they don't have very much damage, and I'm able to do huge damage. So it's going to be difficult for them to stage a comeback here. They choose to Super Harden Gomp, which is the correct choice. Gomp is the target of my attacks right now, and is most likely their only way to pull this back. However, that then leaves Packy very much wide open. I start by putting a Super Harden down on Django, because I think at this point in the match, as long as they can't kill Django, I can just win on damage alone. And with the defense boost plus the Super Harden, that should be relatively easy to manage. I don't hit a crit or a poison this time, but I'm still able to chunk Packy for good damage. And I don't need to do huge damage, I simply need to out-damage BigGigantes. They go for Icy Exhalation. It is technically their best access to damage right now, and they do hit the poison on all my Vivasaurs. However, the poison is simply too slow, especially with Rallying Cry, to be enough on its own here. Here they choose to super harden Packy, likely because they recognize that if they don't, it will die. However, I just don't think that this was the right play. I think Packy is not particularly important anymore, and that saving it for a turn will not change the outcome of the game, and that they would have been better off either trying to potentially get a kill on Goyle, or throwing out a Hail Mary to spread confusion. Without Super Harden, I'm able to crit Gomp for very large damage, and while I likely should have just continued playing the game relatively slow with Rallying Cry and Super Harden, I choose to go for Gomp combo, hoping that this will kill their Gomp, when I should have recognized that it wasn't going to. At this point, Gomp is their only way out of this by spreading confusion that I wouldn't be able to deal with, and so getting rid of it as soon as possible should guarantee me victory. They seemingly recognize that here, going for Ice Crusher, hoping to spread some confusion. They land it on Gomp, miss it on Django, and miss it on Goyle. Gomp is by far the best Venusaur for confusion to hit for me, and the worst for my opponent. While Gomp could potentially waste a large amount of FP here, I truly don't think that there's anything else I need to be worried about. And once again, they probably should have put Super Harden on Gomp at this point. Although even with Super Harden, I doubt that it would have been able to survive the turn. Much less the 2 turns it would take for Gomp to wear off of confusion if I chose not to rally and cry it. Gomp here Super Hardens Goyle, which is far from a bad outcome. I Rallying Cry to clear Gomp's confusion. This should set me up to have a safer endgame, and then use Django to finish off Gomp. Whirling Dash was most likely not necessary, however, I would much rather ensure the kill than save the small amount of FP I could have. And from this point, there's just nothing that Packy can do. It does not have the damage output to deal with the team. Icy Exhalation to poison the team. It truly, at this point, doesn't really matter. There's nothing Packy can do. And with Poison Spines, I am able to close out the game. And what a match this was. I think that it was very close all 3 games, and I think that my opponent, BigGigantes, played extraordinarily well. But I am excited to move on to round 2, and I will see you when that happens.